policies. They tend to agree on world politics. They tend to agree that there should be a world of order. Countries shouldn't be wasting their time fighting over territorial disputes, for instance. And so there's a growing awareness of capitalist peace within social science. And we can, for instance, this summer there's a special issue of one of the leading conflict journals, International Interactions, devoted to the subject. And actually, a lot of the attention has been initiated in part by work right here in Oslo by the International Peace Research Institute. So I very much applaud the work of my friend Indra, and I think it's really in the avant-garde of peace research, particularly on civil wars. And I think it's very relevant for the policy community to be aware of this research. However, I think there is much work to be done. And the primary issue that needs to be addressed at this stage is the issue of exactly what is capitalism. And it's not just an academic issue, there's important policy implications. From Professor de Soys's perspective, capitalism is free markets. So if the state reduces regulation, reduces taxation, you have a more capitalistic economy, and then peace happens. But is that what capitalism is? Is it free markets that are associated with the peace? Capitalism is not necessarily about free markets. This is actually a view that's very common in the past 20 or 30 years. But if you go back 50 years ago, capitalism was often not considered about free markets. It was more voluntary contracts of exchange. A capitalist is what? Somebody who engages in contracts of exchange. And so a capitalistic economy would be one where many of the actors in the economy are engaging in contracts of exchange. And free markets and contracting are not the same thing. Consider that a contract can be free and voluntary, but the state can still regulate the terms of the contracts. And consider that you can have a highly capitalistic economy where people, like Norway by the way, where people regularly use the market to find their jobs, to buy their food, and the state can still engage in relatively high levels of taxation and regulation. And indeed, my own research focuses on contractual exchange, and I directly measure contractual exchange rather than free markets. And actually the two don't exactly go together. There are countries with more free market economies, but low levels of contractual exchange. In fact, I think a lot of the countries in the developing world are in this situation. And you have countries with high levels of contractual exchange and high levels of regulation. High levels of, and so low levels of free markets. And perhaps Sweden is an example, for instance. So the issue, I think the important issue is which is it? Is it free markets or is it capitalism? And to sort this out, one way to think about it is what is the argument? What is the theory for each? And my friend Indra develops the classical liberal argument, I think in a general perspective. It's more classical liberal. And classical liberals kind of take the starting assumption that capitalism is in human nature. It's in our DNA to engage in trade. And so therefore, if the state sort of recedes from the economy, then capitalist development happens. You get an undistorted market. And then peace happens for reasons that were just explained. Markets are not distorted, for instance. So capitalists, since the markets are not distorted, capitalists will use the law. They won't violate the law. And this argument could be correct. This could be right on target. But what I want to emphasize is right now, scientifically, in terms of the evidence that we have, we shouldn't jump too soon to say this is what's going on, that it's about free markets. Because there could be another explanation or other explanations for how capitalism is associated with this peace. So let me mention 4 reasons to be skeptical at this point about is it free markets? Is it the classical liberal argument that is promoting the peace? One is to stop and think about, has there ever been an undistorted market in history? Has there ever been a time where governments have not engaged in regulation, or not much regulation, and real low taxation, and high levels of capitalist enterprise? And I'm not so sure that there has been. And in fact, the obvious model, as was mentioned, of a free market economy is the United States, which generally has the lowest levels of regulation. And what happened in 2008, when suddenly a Great Depression was beginning, this free market model government jumped into the economy to save capitalism. And in fact, the federal government became the owner of the largest insurance conglomerate in the world. Actually, it's pretty socialist. And so the general point I want to make here is that capitalism might not be about free markets. It might be about the state needs to actively be promoting, creating capitalism, which leads to very different policy implications, of course. So that's the first reason to doubt the classical liberal perspective. Second thing to think about is if capitalism is in human nature and it inherently expands and then causes the peace, which is the classical liberal perspective, then how come humans have not reached nirvana thousands of years ago? It's in our DNA. How come we're not there yet? What's holding us back? And that takes us to the third point, that we need to be wary about the human nature arguments about capitalism, non-distorted markets, because actually capitalism is very rare in history, in human history. Humans have been around for a long time. And just think about it. If you have like a 24-hour clock that spans human history, capitalism as a way of life really is probably less than the last second of the last hour of the clock. It's a recent phenomenon. So can it really be in our DNA? Could we all of a sudden evolve it, or perhaps some of us, in such a short period of time, or really a few hundred years? And then fourth and finally, a reason to be skeptical of the classical liberal argument for how capitalism causes peace is the measure that Indra uses in his work, and as Indra does in his own work as a good social scientist. He points out reasons to be critical of the measure. So I'm essentially repeating what Indra himself says in his own work. For one thing, there are some subjective factors in the creation of that measure. So you have to worry about measures that have some subjectivity to them. And also the measure is based on 22 other measures. And some of these other measures are not really about free markets. In fact, they're not at all about free markets. For instance, I counted 4 when I went through the measure. There's conscription, the level of trade that a country engages in, its level of inflation, and the availability of credit. Now, all of these are factors that actually are not about free markets. They're about something else. And so really probably a next step in the research that Indra and I have talked about is working on actually perhaps a better measure of free markets and looking at the data again with perhaps a more pure measure of free markets. So there are reasons to doubt the argument that it's free markets, but that doesn't mean it's not free markets. There's evidence there for it. I just want to raise the reasons to doubt. And let me mention, which I like to think of as the leading alternative theory to free markets. I like to think of it that way because it's from me. I don't know if that actually is the case. But I don't think of free markets when it comes to capitalist peace. I think of, well, capitalism when it comes to capitalist peace. So the peace happens, I argue, when you have an economy where many people are regularly engaging in contracts of exchange, like Norway, like Sweden, like Canada, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea today. And there's nothing about free markets causing that. Maybe free markets do cause that. I don't say they don't, but it's not necessary to the argument.